In 4 years between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed 1 in every 3 people in Europe. In 2022, scientists finally found exactly where it started, and it was not where anyone expected. As you consider the devastating impact of this pandemic, ask yourself, what could have triggered such a catastrophic event, and how did it spread so rapidly across the continent, given that the first recorded outbreak occurred in the city of Messina, Sicily, on October 12, 1347, when a fleet of Genoese ships arrived from the Crimean port city of Caffa, which was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde, led by Yani Beg, since 1346. Before the Black Death ravaged Europe, the continent was already experiencing significant social, economic, and environmental upheaval, with a population that had grown by 50% between 1000 and 1300, leading to widespread poverty, malnutrition, and increased susceptibility to disease, as noted by historian David Herlihy in his 1997 book, The Black Death and the Transformation of the West. The Little Ice Age, which began around 1300, had caused crop failures, famines, and widespread discontent, as documented by climate historian Brian Fagan in his 2000 book, The Little Ice Age, How Climate Made History. You may wonder, how did the combination of these factors create a perfect storm for the pandemic to spread, especially considering that the European population had already been weakened by the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed an estimated 10% of the population, as reported by historian William Chester Jordan in his 1996 book, The Great Famine, Northern Europe in the Early 14th Century. The main events of the Black Death began to unfold on June 24, 1348, when the city of London was afflicted, and by the end of 1349, the pandemic had spread to every corner of Europe, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people, which was approximately 60% of Europe's population, as calculated by historian N.F.R. Crafts in his 1980 study, The Black Death in Medical Science. The biological warfare waged by the Mongols at Caffa in 1346, where they catapulted plague-infested corpses over the city walls, played a significant role in the initial outbreak, as documented by Gabriele de Musi, an Italian notary, in his 1348 account, Historia de Morbo, which describes the siege and the subsequent spread of the disease. Rats, often blamed for the spread of the plague, were only part of the story, as the primary vector was actually the human flea, which lived on the bodies of people and rodents alike, as revealed by a 2018 study published in the journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which analyzed the DNA of ancient fleas found in the teeth of human remains from the time period. As you follow the trail of evidence, ask yourself, what role did human migration and trade play in the dissemination of the disease, considering that the Silk Road, a network of trade routes established during the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE, connected Europe to Central Asia, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and diseases, as noted by historian Jerry Bentley in his 1993 book, Old World Encounters, Cross-Cultural Contacts and Exchanges in Pre-Modern Times. The aftermath of the Black Death saw significant changes in European society, with a drastic shift in the balance of power between laborers and landowners, as the massive reduction in population led to a shortage of workers, resulting in increased social mobility and higher wages, as documented by historian Christopher Dyer in his 2005 book, An Age of Transition, Economy and Society in the Later Middle Ages. The plague also hastened the decline of the feudal system, as the shortage of laborers forced landowners to adopt more flexible and equitable forms of tenure, such as the copyhold system, which emerged in England during the 14th century, as described by historian Rodney Hilton in his 1973 book, Bond Men Made Free, Medieval Peasant Movements and the English Rising of 1381. You may wonder, how did the trauma of the Black Death influence the art, literature, and culture of the time, considering that the works of authors like Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales between 1387 and 1400, and Giovanni Boccaccio, who wrote the Decameron in 1353, reflect the social and psychological impact of the pandemic on European society, as analyzed by literary critic David Wallace in his 1997 book Chaucerian Polity, Absolutist Lineages and Associational Forms in England and Italy. As you reflect on the origins and consequences of the Black Death, consider this: what can we learn from the fact that the pandemic was triggered by a combination of environmental, social, and economic factors, and that its impact was exacerbated by human actions, such as the biological warfare at Caffa, and that the aftermath saw significant changes in the social and economic structures of Europe, as the population decline led to increased social mobility and the emergence of new forms of tenure, ultimately paving the way for the Renaissance and the modern era, as argued by historian Samuel K. Cohn Jr. in his 2002 book, The Black Death, A Personal History.